From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane McAuliffe, the very new director of the Kluge Center in the Office of Scholarly Programs. And in that capacity, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague from the last year when I was a senior scholar here in the Kluge Center, Dr. Stephen Dick, who is our Bloomberg Chair of Astrobiology. I will begin this welcome in the usual way by asking you to turn off your cell phones or any other electronic devices, and also to alert you to the fact that I'm sure you've noticed that today's program is being filmed for the Library of Congress and for the Kluge Center websites, as well as for future placement on the Library of Congress's YouTube and iTunes channels. Now, before welcoming Stephen Dick to this podium, I'd like to say a few words about three things: about the Kluge Center, about the Bloomberg Chair of Astrobiology, and about Stephen Dick himself. The Kluge Center, which is housed right next door to this room, was created 15 years ago. In fact, this year we are celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Kluge Center, and it was created through a very generous gift from philanthropist and entrepreneur John W. Kluge. The Kluge Center has fundamentally two basic functions, one continuous and one more occasional. Every year we create a scholarly community of about 100 researchers in residence. These are senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and doctoral candidates who come here from all across the United States and from well beyond. And they come here for periods ranging from several months to a full year to use the world's largest library and to have access to its unique collections. So that's our continuous function. But about every 2 years, we prepare the Kluge Prize, which is conferred by the Librarian of Congress. The Kluge Prize is an award of $1 million to a scholar that recognizes lifetime achievement in the study of humanity. And we're just gearing up that process in the Kluge Center now. Prize winners in the past have included the historian John Hope Franklin, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and most recently, the political economist and president of Brazil, Henrique Cardoso. And within the Kluge Center sits the Bloomberg Chair of Astrobiology, which is the result of a unique collaboration between the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, its astrobiology program, and the Library of Congress. It takes its name from Nobel Prize winner Baruch or Barry Bloomberg, who was founder of the NASA Astrobiology Institute and a founding member of the Scholars Council at the Library of Congress. Dr. Bloomberg envisioned the creation of a chair in the Kluge Center that would concentrate on connecting scientific discoveries in the field of astrobiology with the best thinking in the humanities and the social sciences. We're very grateful to our colleagues at NASA and to the former director of the Kluge Center for their work and their commitment to the development of this program. And now to our current chair, our current Bloomberg Chair of Astrobiology, Stephen Dick. Stephen Dick is a loyal fan of Indiana University. He did his undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree there and stayed on to do an MA and a PhD in the history and philosophy of science. And then he got some really interesting jobs. From 1979 to 2003, Steve was the astronomer and the historian of science for the United States Naval Observatory. And during those years, he wrote the history of the observatory, the first national observatory in the United States, a history entitled Sky and ocean joined, the U.S. Naval Observatory from 1830 to 2000. In his capacity as a historian there, he also had an opportunity to spend 3 years at the Naval Observatory's Southern Hemisphere station in New Zealand. And then in 2003, Steve was named the chief historian of NASA. In these interesting jobs, he managed to produce an extraordinary body of work. He has written 19 books and numerous articles on astrobiology, astronomy, and the history of science. I won't give you all the titles. You can Google them easily, but I will relay a few just because they are wonderful titles and they capture the range of Steve's work. Plurality of Worlds, The Origins of the Extraterrestrial Life Debate, from Democritus to Kant. The Biological Universe, the 20th Century Extraterrestrial Life Debate, and the Limits of Science. He also wrote, with co-author James Strick, The Living Universe, NASA and the Development of Astrobiology. Steve has also edited several volumes on the societal impact of spaceflight. His most recent book is entitled Discovery and Classification in Astronomy, Controversy and Consensus. That was published by Cambridge University Press last year, as the same press that has published a number of his previous books. Naturally, a body of work of that magnitude and distinction has garnered lots of awards. And again, I can't give the whole list, but NASA itself has awarded Steve Dick twice with an Exceptional Service Medal and a Group Achievement Award. He received the Leroy Doggett Prize for Historical Astronomy in 2006, a prize given by the American Astronomical Society, and in 2004 was the recipient of the Pendleton Prize of the Society for History in the Federal Government for that book about the Naval Observatory that he had done shortly after 2000. But my favorite award of all the awards given to Steve is that he has a star named after him by the International Astronomical Union. I mean, not many of us can put that on our CVs. His lecture this afternoon is entitled How the Discovery of Life Beyond Earth Will Transform Our Thinking. Dr. Dick believes that the discovery of life in the universe is a question of when, not if. And obviously, such a discovery could take multiple forms: microbial life, perhaps complex life, maybe even intelligent life. But researching the scenarios and investigating the potential outcomes and ramifications of such a discovery has been at the heart of Steve's year-long residency at the Kluge Center. I was fascinated to learn that he had used the Kislak collection on the cultures and histories of the Americas, which is a major collection here at the Library of Congress, to examine the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans, and to use it as an analog for what might happen as the result of discovery of life on other planets. You're in for a treat this afternoon. I welcome to the podium Dr. Stephen Dick.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. I have to begin by saying what a fabulous year I've had here at the John W. Kluge Center of the Library of Congress. It began with these congressional hearings, and you see here with Mary Wojtek from NASA and Sarah Seeger from MIT. I went from there to these discussions about searching for life in the universe with my predecessor David Grinspoon, who's right over here, and Joel Achenbach from the Washington Post. We also had the discussions on astrobiology and theology with Robin Lovin, who is also here, and Derek Malone France as the moderator. And finally, we had this two-day symposium on preparing for discovery, how to approach the impact of finding life beyond Earth. So it's been, and this symposium, I have to say, was very interdisciplinary because we had not only scientists, but also historians and philosophers, theologians and anthropologists. And none of this, of course, would have been possible, first of all, without the support of the NASA astrobiology program and the Library of Congress, and specifically without the support of the Kluge Center here. There's a fabulous place wrapped inside this cathedral of learning, which is the Library of Congress. And I also want to thank Barry Blumberg, who Jane introduced, the Nobelist whose broad interest inspired this chair and this all too unusual collaboration between the sciences and the humanities. So, my problem this afternoon is to summarize what I've been doing over the last year in about 40 or 45 minutes. That's always a challenge. The short answer, aside from organizing the symposium last month, is that I've been writing this book with the working title, Cosmic Encounters: How Discovering Life Beyond Earth Will Transform Our Thinking. The long answer is to describe what's in that book, and so I'm going to say a bit about that for starters. Now, those of you who were at the two-day symposium will have heard me speak about this first part here, about the approaches, and I just want to summarize my conclusions, that first part, before I move on to the rest of this. The approaches, the critical issues, and the potential impact of the three sections of the book, and you see the chapters listed there also. Of course, I'll only have time to give you a very top-level review here. Other than that, you'll have to wait for the two books. One is the proceedings of that conference, which Cambridge is going to publish as a trade volume, so you may actually be able to afford to buy it. And the other one will be my own book on this subject. So the first problem that I was confronted with is, how do you even approach this problem of discovering life beyond Earth, including how it might transform our thinking? So here you see the three of the approaches that I've adopted: history, discovery, and analogy, examining the reaction when people thought life had been discovered, discovery, the nature of scientific discovery, and analogy, using past events as a guideline. So starting with history, here you see, I won't read these, but here are 6 times over the last 200 years that we thought extraterrestrial life had been detected. So we can ask, what was the reaction then? Let me focus just very briefly on 3 of those. The first one, the moon hoax there, a series of 6 stories in the New York Sun in 1835, almost 180 years ago. And according to these articles, the astronomer Sir John Herschel, observing from South Africa, had observed this on the moon. This is from the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs collection. These large winged creatures that you see here, about 4 feet in height, evidently engaged in conversation and therefore intelligent. Now, it didn't matter that scientists knew that the conditions on the moon didn't support life. It didn't matter that no telescope on Earth could have had this resolving power to see this anyway. They still don't even today. And it didn't matter that the entire series was a product of a fevered imagination, as it turned out. What mattered was that the upstart New York Sun quickly became the most read newspaper in the world. And it turns out that scholars now know that Richard Adams Locke wrote these stories in the New York Sun, not as a hoax, but as a satire. What was he satirizing? He was satirizing the advocates of inhabited worlds, of which there were many at the time. In particular, one astronomer by the name of Thomas Dick. No relation as far as I know, but he had arrived at a figure of 21 trillion inhabitants in the solar system, and that didn't count the sun. We arrived at our first lesson from history, which is that in the short term, the facts aren't particularly going to matter. What the media says will matter, and the perception and not the reality. So this was a short-lived reaction, but it certainly fed into the culture and the tradition of the plurality of worlds and this idea that life might be common out there. And that's also true of the second example a century later, the War of the Worlds, on Halloween Eve. This is Halloween Eve, isn't it? 1938, Orson Welles broadcast this famous War of the Worlds episode, which led some to believe that interplanetary conflict had begun with a Martian invasion. Now, subsequent studies have shown that they portrayed the reaction as panic and mass hysteria, but this too is an exaggeration, it turns out, with consensus now being that there was actually very little panic at all. Now, if you look at the newspapers at the time, like the New York Times and all the others, there's no doubt that they reported that there was panic, but it turns out these were based mostly on anecdotal reports. And so scholars have concluded that these stories represented an irresistible opportunity for the print media to get back at this newfangled medium called radio, which was an upstart source of news and advertising. So they portrayed that as untrustworthy and unreliable. Of course, they were being untrustworthy themselves in spreading that myth that there was a large-scale panic. On the 75th anniversary of the broadcast in 2013, PBS was still perpetuating the myth in its American Experience series. So between the moon hoax and the War of the Worlds, that's 2 strikes out for the media. And then the third episode I want to move to very quickly is just the Mars rock. And this one is, I think, most interesting because it's a case involving real science. Some of you will recall that in 1996, well, some of you were there when this happened at NASA, that NASA reported that these rocks from Mars contained evidence of nanofossils, in other words, past life on Mars. Press conferences were held. President Clinton made remarks on the South Lawn. Vice President Gore held a symposium on the implications. Congressional hearings were held, and numerous claims and counterclaims were published in scientific journals. Theologians opined on the meaning of it all, and the media, of course, went wild. Entire books have been written on this episode in the last 20 years. Suffice it to say that the Mars rocks themselves are real, which is astonishing enough in itself. We do have rocks from Mars that land on the Earth. But the consensus is that these fossils, so-called fossils, are not real. In the end, the case of the Mars rock offers, I think, the most robust example in the modern era of what might happen following the claim of life beyond Earth, even if the claim is only fossils or microbes, much less intelligence. The reaction of government institutions, the media, and the public will occur side by side with the reaction among scientists who will subject the discovery to withering criticism. The media will play an important role in both reporting and sensationalizing any claims. With the internet and other social media, news of the discovery of life beyond Earth would spread like wildfire these days compared to even 20 years ago, I think. But as the Mars rock demonstrates, the final conclusion will be far from immediate. Rather, it's going to consist of an extended process that's characteristic really of all discoveries, which brings me to my second approach there, which is discovery. So I want to say just a few words about that, and I always like to cite this excellent book here. One of the main conclusions of that book is that no matter what you look at in astronomy, no matter what discovery you look at, it's never just a matter of pointing your telescope and making the discovery, understanding what you're looking at. Never in one fell swoop. There's no such thing as immediate discovery in astronomy, and I would venture to say in science in general. The anatomy of discovery always goes something like this, where you have detection followed by interpretation and then understanding, and this can go over a period of years or even decades. And I give numerous examples in the book for 82 classes of astronomical objects. It's always the same kind of pattern. And so, I would suggest that the same would be true of the discovery of extraterrestrial life in whatever form. Something will be detected, and there'll be years of decades or decades of interpretation, as the Mars rock shows, and full understanding will take even longer. These are all very important points if we're going to talk intelligently about the impact of discovery. Now, another essential point while we're talking about discovery is that there are many discovery scenarios. And I won't have time to go over these in detail. But first of all, of course, there's the great divide between microbial life and intelligent life. I'm not going to go over this, but I parse I parse it in general by direct and indirect contact and on the Earth or off of the Earth, terrestrial or extraterrestrial. So you can come up with a kind of matrix like this and see what the various scenarios might be for microbes. Most of the action these days is taking place in the third quadrant there, the encounter type 3, where we have robotic exploration. The same thing for intelligent life discoveries, the same kind of parsing and matrix. And again, you see what the logical possibilities are there, including encounter type 1, where you have direct terrestrial contact, which would be the UFO claim. But most of the action, again, here is in the quadrant 3, where you have radio searches for extraterrestrial signals. And of course, there's been lots of science fiction written about this, mainly about the intelligent part, because that seems to be make a better story, although there have been a few science fiction novels written about microbial discovery. Now, but the point is that the reaction will depend very much on the scenario, and this brings me to my third approach, analogy. And the first thing I want to do here is insist that analogy is not just a wishy-washy kind of an argument when you're desperate and don't have anything else to, any other argument. Cognitive science expert Douglas Hofstadter, some of you will have heard of, remember Douglas Hofstadter, his most famous book is Gödel, Escher, Bach, wrote this about analogy, and he's just recently written an entire volume on analogy. I won't read this whole thing, but to him, the bottom line there is, to me, analogy is anything but a bitty blip. Rather, it's the very blue that fills the sky of cognition. Analogy is everything, or very nearly so in my view. In other words, we use analogy all the time, even when we don't realize that we're using it. It's a very common mode of argument. On the other hand, we have to be very careful. As the anthropologist Catherine Denning reminds us, the problems with analogies is that they're highly persuasive, they're inherently limited, and they're easily overextended. And of course, we're not claiming that we're going to predict the future, we're just laying out scenarios here. So if scientists can use analogs, I figured, why can't we use them in history and in social sciences? So that's one of my approaches. So the question then is, what kind of analogs would you best use with respect to the impact of finding life? And I laid out 4 different scenarios, just very quickly. Here just to state that astrobiologists themselves use analogy all the time. They have to, because they don't have the extraterrestrial life, so they have to use these various kinds of analogies. So the first analogy, if we discover microbes, what I call the microbe analogy. Whatever else it may be, I think the discovery of microbes beyond Earth in any form would potentially represent a revolution in biology, depending on the nature of the microbes found. And taking this as our starting points, you can ask, therefore, what discoveries in the history of biology might approximate such extraterrestrial discoveries. More specifically, assuming that such a discovery would change our view of life, what discoveries in biology have changed biologists' view of life? A number of candidates come to mind, including the Darwinian evolution by natural selection, the role of genetics, of DNA in genetics, the discovery of extremophile microorganisms, and so on. But perhaps no biological discovery closer approximates the potential fallout than the discovery of terrestrial microbes themselves, representing a new world of life on Earth. Before the 17th century, we didn't know that this world existed of microbes, and it was only in the 1660s and 70s that these two remarkable geniuses, Robert Hooke and Antony van Leeuwenhoek, discovered this new microbial world. So what was the reaction? Well, Robert Hooke wrote a book which was a bestseller for the time called Micrographia. It was a sensation for a while with the diagrams of what he saw. But the surprising thing and the striking thing is that scant research was done in the study of microbial life for the next century or even more. Only in the 19th century did microbiology begin to develop into a science, and today both the positive and negative effects of microbes in medicine and in the modern world cannot be overestimated, of course, as we see with Ebola, for example. The same will probably be true of extraterrestrial microbes, that we cannot foresee what the implications might be. So there are all kinds of other revolutions of biology that could also be good analogies, and it's the common lessons from all of them, I think, that will illuminate the problem of the impact of discovering microbes. That's the microbe analogy. Now, Jane mentioned the Kislak collection, which I've also used many times I've gone up to the next floor up there to visit the Kislak collection and this great exhibit on culture contacts with Europeans with the Americas. Of course, terrestrial history abounds with these contacts between cultures, usually with unhappy effects. And so one often hears about such contacts as analogies to contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, usually in the context of the Western age of discovery. And so here, you probably can't see this very well, but from the National Museum of the American Indian, just down the street, an example of a couple of dozen contacts of Europeans with the Americas. One particularly vivid example is the one there, of course, in Mexico, which Cortez and the Aztecs in 1519. And if you go upstairs, you'll see these giant murals depicting these contacts, first contacts. In this one, you see, it begins pretty well, offering presents and that sort of thing, but very quickly degrading to this, the destruction of Tenochtitlan. So that's the lesson that's usually drawn. So, but the point is that I think that's only one example, and it's very dangerous to draw conclusions from a sample of one. In fact, outside the tradition of Western expansionism, the less well-known great voyages of the Chinese treasure fleets 50 years before Columbus offer a very different scenario, and some of you may have seen the Gavin Menzies book on this, which I think he claims that the Chinese actually discovered America in 1421, but I don't think the evidence is there for that. But the fact of these treasure fleets is very much real, and so you can look at what the impact of those expeditions were. So in contrast to the case of Cortez and the Aztecs, Chinese culture contacts resulted in new embassies in the Near East and deification to this day of Zheng He and his cult in Southeast Asia, the publication of works enlarging Chinese knowledge of the oceans and the land masses. So my point is that there are other models of culture contact than the Western ones that we usually hear about, including Jesuit models of culture contact that were not disastrous, but point out the difficulties among cultures of communication and even grasping certain concepts such as immortality and the soul. And there's a large literature there about Jesuit contacts with some of the American natives. And also there are many other lessons I think you can learn from culture contacts, including European conceptions of the other prior to contact as analogs to how we perceive aliens. So I could go on about this. There's a lot I think that can be learned, even if the contact is not direct, which is not likely to be in the case of extraterrestrials. If you take any one interaction as an exemplar, almost any lesson could be learned, but it's far better to learn from the entire set of cultural contact experiences, or better yet, to learn collective lessons common to all these experiences. And so we can't, I think, draw any definitive conclusions based on a small sample of culture contacts, but the determination of characteristics common to all these contacts, plus all these other aspects of contacts about communication and conceptual difficulties, I think, is a respectable research program that could pay significant dividends. Lots more could be said about that, but let me move on to another. If you don't have direct contact, if you have indirect contact, what I call the decipherment translation analogy, if that contact is, for example, by radio contact and significant information is transmitted, then the flow of information between civilizations across time is a more appropriate analog. And I was just reading Toynbee recently. He actually has a whole section on civilizations across time, not direct contact, but across time. Particularly compelling is the transmission, as an analog, I think, is this transmission of Greek knowledge to the Latin West by way of the Arabs in the 11th and 12th centuries. The whole Toledo school of translation in Spain, all this is very well known. And other people have said, well, in that case, the languages at least were known, so it may be more of a decipherment like the Mayan glyphs and that sort of thing. Or you could, in the more modern era, Gutenberg and the printing press, or even the internet. I mean, to ask what has been the impact of the internet in terms of information flow, you begin to see how big of a problem this really is. Finally, I'll just mention one more before we go on, and that is the worldview analogy. Even if an extraterrestrial signal is not deciphered, and perhaps that only microbial life is discovered considering or constituting a second genesis, I think a change of worldview would likely gradually take place. I would argue that the discovery of microbial or intelligent life beyond Earth might be analogous to the changes in worldview or the changes that happened in the wake of these scientific worldviews, such as the Copernican, Darwinian, the Hubbly-Shapley worldview at the beginning of the 20th century. So again, these have been studied in great details, and we could ask, what do they tell us? One very general thing they tell us is that worldviews change very gradually. So to summarize just this first part, give you some conclusions there. The lessons of history are very difficult, but history, discovery, and analogy offer a grounding in experience. We can't make predictions. We can only have scenarios and guidelines. Analogy can be as powerful in history as it is in science. Discovery may be unique. It may be not like anything else we've ever done before, but the alternative then is to say, okay, we can't talk about it at all. And even if no life is found, I think that these are good thought experiments. So let me move on now to sort of the second part of the talk, how the discovery will transform our thinking. You might be wondering when I'm going to get to that, but actually what we've been talking about is transforming our thinking. First of all, as my colleague at Notre Dame, the historian of science Michael Crow, has argued, our thinking has already been invaded by aliens, as witnessed the long history of the debate over extraterrestrial life that both he and I have written about. As Washington Post reporter Joel Achenbach has argued in his book, not just science, but popular culture has been captured by aliens. Here are a few examples. As witnessed the science fiction literature and some of the most popular movies of all times. And if you want to see, you see there the Contact movie poster. If you want to see how an alien is constructed, you can go down to the manuscripts division over in the Madison building and see there are like 12 boxes, 100 or more folders about how, in the Sagan collection, about how the alien was constructed for the book and the movie Contact. So this slide just shows the tip of the iceberg of how this idea has seized Western culture. And I think that's curious, by the way, that it seems to have seized Western culture much more than Eastern cultures. I think why that would be is an interesting research topic, which I've not had a chance to look into, but somebody should, I think. Secondly, think about some of the analogies that I mentioned earlier. How did the discovery of microbes transform our thinking? How did culture contacts transform our thinking? How have the Copernican, the Darwinian, the Hubble worldviews transformed our thinking? If you think about that, you begin to see the great potential that the discovery of life will have to transform our thinking. And you note that none of these things happened overnight. Microbes and culture contacts and worldviews took centuries to reveal their full transformational effect. And just as I argued that discovery is an extended process, so I would suggest also will be the full impact of the discovery of life. Some argue that because the majority in Western culture already believe in extraterrestrial life, that we've already felt the full impact, but I would argue that the idea and the reality are two very different things. So now let me go beyond, in the last part of the talk, beyond history, culture, contacts, and worldviews to some more specific areas, quite different, where our current thinking is being challenged. And I'll choose just three here. First, a general category that I call universalizing knowledge. Surely the discovery of microbes, even microbes, would contribute to the long-sought goal of a universal biology. We have only one basic example of biology here on Earth, carbon-based, with a DNA genetic code using water as a solvent. And as was pointed out at our symposium last month, what if we found out that life was carbon-based but had an RNA or a protein genetic code and a solvent different than water? Conditions exist on planets in our own solar system where that might just be possible. And of course, we have outside of our solar system now thousands of planets where that might also be possible. So discovering any of those, we might have a chance of formulating a universal biology. astrobiologist Chris McKay and philosopher Carol Cleland have pointed out that we'll never be able to formulate a definition for life until we have a living systems theory, and for that you need more than one example of life. Well, what about the rest of science? We fancy that at least we have a universal physics, but the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence raises the interesting question of just how universal our terrestrial science really is. Would alien science be the same as ours? That's a question that's guaranteed to raise eyebrows and even eye-rolling if you're talking to a group of scientists. Because they argue, well, of course science is universal. The laws of physics got us to the moon. The laws of physics operate everywhere we can see, billions of light years away. But that's not exactly the question that I'm asking. My question here is, would extraterrestrials have the same laws of physics? Would extraterrestrials have the same mathematics? Philosophers and scientists could give two very different answers. Most scientists say, yes, of course, but the philosophers are more likely to argue against that. Here's one example. The philosopher Nicholas Rescher, writing in an article about extraterrestrial science. And I won't read this whole thing, but he says, we are deeply mistaken if we think of it as a process that must follow a route roughly parallel to ours and issue in a comparable product. It would be grossly unimaginative to think that either the journey or the destination must be the same or even substantially similar. Now, this also goes to the issue of social constructionism of science, of course, that science is a social construct. I must say that I'm skeptical of the strongest claims, at least, of social constructionism. Obviously, society and social ideas and processes have an influence on science, but I'm skeptical of the strongest claims of that science is not objective. But in the extraterrestrial context, the proponents of constructionism, social constructionism, might have been ahead of their times. I mean, according to Rescher, for example, science out there could be very different, even if they're interested in science. We don't know whether they'll be interested in science either. So that's an interesting problem. Now, how about mathematics? Surely 1 + 1 is equal 2 anywhere in the universe, right? Well, this depends on whether you're a Platonist and think that numbers are objective entities out there waiting to be discovered, or whether you're a formalist and think that mathematics is invented. This is a field called there's a field in cognitive science called embodied cognition that argues that cognition really depends on the body that you're in. And here's an example which kind of succinctly says what that theory means. Cognition depends on the kinds of experiences that come from having a body with particular perceptual and motor capacities that are inseparably linked, and that together form the matrix within which memory, emotion, language, and all other aspects of life are meshed. So, if that's the case, then we might be in trouble in terms of mathematics even being universal. And if you don't believe me, you can read this large book called Where Mathematics Comes From. George Lakoff, some of you may have heard, cognitive science expert George Lakoff has written lots of books, but one of them is Where Mathematics Come From. And he says, is there any scientific evidence that what's proved in human mathematics is an objective universal truth? No such evidence, he says. The answer is no. And this also goes to an old problem that goes back 50 years or more from Eugene Wigner, the Princeton physicist, Nobel Prize winner, I think, who wrote an article in 1960, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. He pointed out in that article the uncanny accuracy of our mathematical abilities to match nature's reality, something that you wouldn't expect from evolution alone. For him, mathematics remained a mystery, a wonderful gift with which we neither understand nor deserve. So it's still a fundamental question, I think, in the philosophy of mathematics, and certainly when you start to think about the implications and how our thinking might be transformed if we make contact with extraterrestrials and they don't have the same kind of mathematics or science that we have. Now, if you think these questions are academic, well, think again, because they bear very much on our ability to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence. In terms of embodied cognition, case one would be unlikely, I think, that you have complete overlap in terms of the mental structures and modes of perceiving. You might have a case two where you have partial overlap, or even a case three where there's no overlap, in which case your only hope would be a case four where you have a dialogue chain. Terrestrial intelligence could not talk to extraterrestrial intelligence four there, but only directly it could not, but only through that kind of a chain. So these things all come in if we actually do make contact with life out there. Now, there's a whole series of other questions in cognitive science that I don't have time to go into here. We went into them to some extent in the symposium, and I talk about them in the book also, having to do with intelligence, the nature of intelligence, the nature of consciousness. John Searle, the philosopher, was here, and we talked about this somewhat. I asked him what he thought about intelligence. He said, intelligence is not the question. The question is consciousness. Where did consciousness come from? So there's this whole series of questions here that I'm not going to have time to go over, but this is all part of the problem. So I think this question of universal knowledge is a very exciting one. One of the areas where our thinking will be transformed. A second broad area is a change in our worldview, the kind of thing that I did mention earlier. And I want to connect this again with what's been called astroculture by one of our people here in the audience, Alex Geppert, right over here from Germany. Astroculture, I think it's safe to say that over the last 50 years of the space age, we've become more conscious of the cosmos in which we live. We live at a time of increasing awareness of the universe around us. The cosmic connection that Sagan talked about in 1973, spread far and wide by his Cosmos series in 1980, and then again by Neil Tyson in the Cosmos 2 just this last year, has only been increased by this spectacular imagery from the Hubble Space Telescope, by images like Earthrise there and the blue marble, as well as lots of other spacecraft images. And surely the discovery of life beyond Earth in any form would accelerate this astroculture, which, by the way, also includes things like the whole UFO debate and all that sort of thing. So I think that has the potential to transform our worldview, but it would be over a long period of time. Now, one of the manifestations of this would be, I think, in terms of religion and theology, which we spoke about last June. We had a seminar on that. Now, a dominating feature of human cultures, for better or worse, is this variety of religions and their accompanying theologies. And whatever the other effects, I think the effects of discovery of life beyond Earth on theology would be pervasive and transformational and personal. How the discovery of extraterrestrial life might affect religion and theology has long been the subject of debate since Copernicus made the Earth a planet and the planet's potential Earth. And the subject, of course, has heated up again in the last couple of decades since planets have been discovered beyond the solar system, and has given rise, believe it or not, to a growing field called astrotheology, or sometimes exotheology, or sometimes cosmotheology. I've actually written an article on cosmotheology. Other people have written articles on astrotheology. But under whatever name, these terms embody the radical idea that our theologies may need to be expanded or be modified in wholesale fashion to encompass the new worldview that 13.7 billion years of cosmic evolution has resulted in abundant planets and perhaps abundant life and mind beyond the Earth. And this raises questions that are both general and particular to each religion. At our symposium, we had a Jesuit, Guy Consolmagno. Consolmagno discussed this in the Christian tradition under the title, "Would you baptize an extraterrestrial?" That's a question that even the Pope has spoken about in the last year or so. Consolmagno's answer was, "Only if it asked," which I think is an improvement over the European culture contacts with the West, right? And among the Abrahamic traditions, in other words, not just Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam, there is some tradition in Judaism of a discussion of this, but I have not been able to find any discussion in Islam. And I think, again, that's a very interesting thing, which I don't know how to explain. I'll leave that to others to explain. And I think it has to be explained in terms of the broader culture, again, of why we in the West are so obsessed with this when others don't seem to be. But here you see, in terms of astrotheology, this was written more than 100 years ago by Alice Meynell, a very well-known poet. Oh, be prepared, my soul, to read the inconceivable, to scan the million forms of God, those stars unroll, when in our turn we show to them a man. Well, I found that most theologians, and we have a few of them here today, most scholars in religious studies, even much of the general public, are excited about the possibility of life and how it might expand our theological horizons. Conversely, I would say that one might argue also that religions could play a role, will play a role in helping us cope with the discovery of life, just as it helps us cope with other transformational events. Let me just give one more example in an area that I would call astroethics. In addition to astroculture and astrotheology, astroethics. And here we ask questions such as, what is our moral responsibility to alien life? Are aliens good guys or bad guys? Is it to be the friendly E.T. who only wants to go home? Or is it to be the War of the Worlds? Both of those themes have long pedigrees in science fiction literature. And of course, this goes to the question of extraterrestrial altruism. You might think that's far out, but believe it or not, there's an entire volume of essays on extraterrestrial altruism edited by Doug Vakoch. And one of our symposium speakers, Carol Cleland, posed the question, what is the moral status of non-human organisms? So, I mean, that's not just an extraterrestrial question, but also a question here on the Earth and in terms of other animals. This, in turn, bears on the question, what does it mean to be human? Now, that question has been asked before, of course. If you go down to the Natural History Museum and see the Human Origins exhibit, you see it asked in terms of what makes us unique, what makes us different from all the other primates. But now it's asked from an extraterrestrial perspective. Instead of asking how we differ from primates, how will we differ from extraterrestrials? Well, I could go on here, but let me wrap up by saying that people over the course of my year here have asked, sometimes with a skeptical tone, why are you studying this problem of the impact of finding life? And I say, well, first, because someday these questions that we've been raising here might be very practical policy questions. And here, for example, this question of what we do if we find life was actually raised at both congressional hearings on astrobiology in the last year. What do we do? Do we announce it to the world? Do we research more? What do we do when we make the discovery? So it's a policy question. So why not just wait until the day that they arrive and worry about it then? Well, you might as well ask, why not wait until Ebola gets here and worry about it then? We've seen that it's better to think these things out before, right? Not that I want to associate astrobiology with Ebola, but I think the point needs to be made that we need to think ahead of time about the impact of science on society in general, preferably before the impact occurs. The Human Genome Project scientists certainly thought so. They have a very robust program on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the Human Genome Project. Now, secondly, as we saw very vividly in our symposium, astrobiology brings together many disciplines, not just from the natural sciences, but also from the social sciences, the humanities, philosophy, and theology. Astrobiology, in its broadest sense, bids fair, I think, to be an excellent vehicle for what E.O. Wilson at Harvard, of sociobiology fame, called consilience, the unity of knowledge, bringing the sciences, the humanities, and all these other disciplines together. And as I've said before, even if no life is found, taking an extraterrestrial perspective on these age-old problems can only broaden our horizons. Now, thirdly and finally, I expect some people are thinking about what may be the elephant in the room, which is, are we barking up the wrong tree? As one congressman put it in the astrobiology hearings, is it conceivable there is not extraterrestrial life? And I gave a somewhat snarky answer, as I recall. I said, yes, it is conceivable because you just conceived it. But the congressman, I think, had a good sense of humor. And of course, it is possible. But I think, in my opinion, it's very unlikely. Why? Not just because of the recent discoveries that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, but also because of the basic principles that we believe govern the universe. Principles that Iris Fry identified in our symposium as the Copernican and Darwinian principles, which hold that wherever life can arise, it will arise. Now, of course, these are presuppositions, but there are presuppositions based on evidence. Some presuppositions are better than others, right? My presuppositions are the best ones, I think. So, and I think these presuppositions are pretty good for astrobiology because they are based on evidence, although we can't assume what we're trying to prove either. So we have to be very careful. We are the product of, oh, well, I put this up again because I love this. I love this artwork, and you see the Capitol right over here in the background with the alien as teacher. And this, believe it or not, is from, if my memory serves, about 1922, the alien as teacher. So we are the products of the unrolling of 13.7 billion years of cosmic evolution. And to me, it would be truly extraordinary if on some of those billions of planets around other stars, there was not another genesis of life, even taking into account our presuppositions, which we make explicit. Well, if life is so common, people say, why haven't you found it? And that's what's called the famous Fermi paradox. And I always like to remind the skeptics that we've undertaken only a very preliminary reconnaissance. SETI searches in any systematic sense have only reached a few hundred light years in a galaxy that's 100,000 light years across. That's our Milky Way galaxy. Kepler's exoplanet searches looked only at one tiny part of the sky. And so I think we shouldn't be discouraged by the lack of discovery of life so far, which has only looked at an extremely small part of the volume of space in our own galaxy, in a universe that looks like this. You see the scale here. That 30 means 30 arc seconds. The moon is 1,800 arc seconds in the sky. So this entire thing, all the way across, is something like 1/18 the size of the moon. It's like looking through a straw. And every image, virtually every image here, is another galaxy. Not a star in our galaxy, but another galaxy, each of which has billions of stars. So that's why I say that to find life would be astonishing, but in my view, not to find life would be even more astonishing. Talk about the implications of that. And that's why I think the search will and should continue in the great tradition of our species to explore. At a time when it's clear that there's a great deal that we do not know about the universe at a deep level, I think it's prudent to keep an open mind on the great questions of cosmology and life. As Carl Sagan and others have emphasized, however, our minds should not be so open that our brains fall out. Or, as Sagan has said more eloquently, what is called for is an exquisite balance between two conflicting needs: the most skeptical scrutiny of all hypotheses that are served up to us, and at the same time, a great openness to new ideas. So I will leave you with that thought and express my thanks, my final thanks to NASA, the Library of Congress, and the John W. Kluge Center, and thank you all for coming.
Steve, thank you very much. That was as provocative and as interesting as one could imagine. We have about 15 minutes for questions before I will draw us to a close and invite us to a reception. There is a microphone, and we will need to use it because this is being recorded. So Steve will take his own questions, and I will come back up to the podium in a few minutes.
Anybody have a question? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for giving us so much to think about. As you pointed out, the reaction will come from the scenario, but you know far more than I and far more than many people. Which area, if you had to project or guess, this is very difficult, would the change or the transformation be most, I guess, have most impact? Would it be religion, do you think? Would it be some area? And again, I know that's almost impossible to answer. So I'm asking you a question that's impossible to answer. Would you please answer that?
I thought at first you were going to say which scenario would have the most impact. Obviously, the scenario that would have the most impact would if they landed over here. But which area? You're right. It is difficult to say. But I think religion and theology, because so many people, no matter what you think about religion and theology, somebody told me after the Jesuit spoke about would you baptize an extraterrestrial? They said, I don't care if you would baptize one or not. But the point is that a few billion people do care. And all the other religions' ramifications. So I think that probably would be a major area, but also science, even in the case of the discovery of microbes. And you saw that in the case of the discovery of terrestrial microbes, as I explained, it took a long time because, and I didn't explain why, part of it is because of the technology. The microscopes were terrible. They could, to first see these things, and they just couldn't go much further until another century or so when the microscope technology improved. But I think discovery of microbes would have an effect in terms of not just the universality of universal biology, but also in terms of what we, how our concepts of life would change, and even potentially the use of those microbes for medical purposes or whatever. Now that's thinking down the way a little bit, but they're already using these extremophile microbes that they find 10,000 feet under the ocean in the hydrothermal vents. They're already making use of those for medical purposes. So I think if you extend that, it would happen. Yep. Here. Yeah.
You mentioned there you're hearing me, yeah?
Yep.
You mentioned the advance of technology being crucial to the discovery process. Now, in my head, I'm getting a picture that the most dramatic example of contact would be them landing over on Capitol Hill, but the least dramatic would probably be we seeing evidence of extraterrestrial life without any reciprocation. Now, you also mentioned the discovery of planets outside the solar system being one of the most interesting advances of recent years. So to what extent do you think that technology will improve over the next few decades to the point where we may be able to perceive extraterrestrial civilizations with our own eyes?
Oh, well.
Or is that just predicting the future?
With our own eyes, depends exactly what you mean. What is advancing at a very rapid pace now, and will be with the James Webb Space Telescope, which is the follow-up to Hubble, and with something called TESS, terrestrial extrasolar planets signatures or something like that, is that you'll be able to look at the atmospheres of those exoplanets and see if there is a biosignature there. In other words, if it has oxygen or something else. And then the argument will be, well, is that biogenic or not, and is it really due to life? But there's a lot of work going on that now. But being able to see with your own eyes something like the 1835 moon hoax there is not going to happen anytime that I can see in the future, in the near future, I'll say. I'll never say never, but that would take some real revolution to be able to see something like that. On the other hand, spacecraft exploration will continue, and the problem there is that the exploration, at least as far as going there, is largely within our solar system. If you want to go to the next nearest star, it's 4.5 light years away. And those stars are a long way away, and so you have to use the remote sensing that we see with the Hubble and other spacecraft, and that's mainly using the techniques like biosignatures. Yep.
So I'm curious about the contemporary political implications of your work. Presumably, insofar as this discovery will happen in the future, the we who do the encountering will not be the we that we are now. So what should we be doing to become the we that will
To become the
encounter them
we
in the
who are
future?
prepared?
Yeah.
Why? Doing studies like I've been doing this last year. You know, I don't think this cosmic consciousness, as that increases, I think we think more and more in terms of what we might do, but I don't see what you can do in concrete terms except for discussing this sort of thing. I think it is important to have input to policy in terms of, you know, whether or not we should do the search and that sort of thing, but also in terms of what the impact might be. As I said, when the time comes, when the impact when we actually make the discovery, it might be quite different. But if you lay out all these different scenarios, at least you'll have some basis for proceeding. Do you have something in mind yourself? I'd be interested to know. Astrobiology, right. Well, you know, NASA funding for astrobiology is to the tune of several tens of millions of dollars, and it's almost entirely for the search for microbial life. The Astrobiology Institute, you know, funds 15 institutions or something like that to do laboratory research and that sort of thing. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, on the other hand, has been entirely private for the last 20 years. Because Congress voted in 1993 to cut all funding for SETI. Now you see, so that has been private. So NASA, strictly speaking, is not involved in that. I expect that will totally change if they get a signal that the government will be involved, including NASA. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I have a question based on your research. If you have any sense, do you think that such a discovery, and I realize that it would depend on the scenario, would draw humanity together or divide us even more than we already are? From your historical precedents, then, the analogies that you've looked at, do you have any sense of the way it would kind of fall out?
I would optimistically say that it would draw us together, but I think that might be unrealistic to say that it would draw us together. People thought that when we saw the blue marble, the Earth, or the moon rise, that shouldn't that draw us together? There are no borders there. And then, you know, you had books like Fukuyama's The End of History, with the downfall of the Soviet Union. Well, history didn't end, did it? That's a great question that could be researched more, I think, but in the end, I think you just have to sort of wait to see what would happen. I doubt, unless it was some kind of attack, but now you're getting into the whole movie scenario thing, you know, and even then I'm not confident that we would all get together and be united, so thanks.
One question I have that I'm sure you've thought about is, especially if you were planning to sit in front of Congress or something like that, have you ever thought about what you might answer if someone asks, okay, well, what are the direct policy implications of this? Like, what are three things that government should do differently based on your research? I know that's maybe also a hard question, like everyone else's question's been, but anything concrete that you can think of? Well,
they could get, first of all, an interdisciplinary group together to talk about what the policy should be. I mean, there have been sporadic cases of the International Academy of Astronautics doing what they call the SETI protocols and that sort of thing. But basically, those have not gone any further than to say that you should verify your findings and then tell everybody. In other words, don't cause panic by giving a false alarm, although it's probably what will happen. And in the microbial realm, of course, there are the planetary protection protocols which NASA has, but again, those are relatively short term. So I think one thing that could be done would be to get a group, not just of scientists and not just of humanities people, but of scientists, humanities people, philosophers and theologians together to talk about this. Now, of course, policy has its limits. I don't think you want to set policy for religion. What's going to happen probably is what's going to happen, although it can be informed by these discussions that we're doing now, but I don't think you want to set policy for some areas like that. But so the first one would be to get a group together to talk about, an interdisciplinary group to talk about these sorts of things and make some recommendations. I know that's always what's done in the government. Usually they don't get very far. But that's one thing, and I'll have to think about the other two. Yep.
Thanks for the enlightening talk. My question is, what is it like being a human in the astrobiology or digital world?
Astrobiology?
Astrobiology or digital world, the two disciplines. How would you define a human-like?
Digital? Did you say digital?
Digital world.
Digital world.
Technology.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, elaborate a little more.
Yeah. How is it like,
Oh.
human in the discipline or in the area of astrobiology or digital, when you apply some digital technology? So how does it change
Does
the definition of human?
shape the definition? I would say it would, if we consider in terms of if we find life out there and consider our place in the great chain of being. I thought what you were trying to say was in terms of artificial intelligence or that sort of thing, which is another question. And people have written about the post-biological universe, that they may not be, and this also goes to the same question. If, we have 13.7 billion years of cosmic evolution, and intelligent life could have been evolving long before we ever came about, maybe there are post-biologicals out there. And where does that put us? The biological intelligence that we are here might just be a passing phase. And so what does it mean to be human? We can also ask in terms of artificial intelligence research going on right now. Now, if you talk to people like John Searle, they think that artificial intelligence is in principle not possible. To build a machine and intelligence that is more intelligent than we are. But if you had 1 billion years, which they have had out there, maybe there would be machine intelligence. So, yeah, that's a great problem to contemplate. I don't know the answer, except that it would have some effect.
I would like you to join me, first of all, in a reception where we can continue our conversation and your questions of Dr. Dick. But please join me most of all in thanking him for a very stimulating afternoon.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.